Well, hello. Welcome to the Stanford Gen channel and to Foothill College LGBTQIA plus History and Heritage Month. And we kicked off yesterday with a wonderful opening day ceremony. And then today I am welcoming internationally celebrated author and radio personality and commentator Sandip Roy, who is a Bay Area favorite. I'm going to give a quick bio, although I think Sandip can tell us more. As a young man, Sandip moved from India to the United States to continue his education, got his computer science degree, and then came to the Bay Area like so many others, and launched a quite successful career as a tech bro, and then shocked his family, not only by coming out, but worse yet, by leaving his tech bro job and becoming a writer and radio commentator. So the first time I ever sort of quote unquote met Sandip Roy was, like so many other Bay Area residents, was driving down the freeway, and he started doing KALW, our local NPR outlet, commentaries, which we all love, and then turned out NPR loved, so then they went national for many, many years. Like me, Sandip has recently moved home. He to Kolkata, India, me to the somewhat less colorful suburban environs of Denver, Colorado. Nevertheless, we both moved back to help take care of our mommies, just like good gay boys should, right? And I moved to a Chihuahua, and you left your Chihuahua behind, but we are also owned by Chihuahuas in various ways. And so, without too much further ado, Sandip, welcome back as always to Foothill College.
Thank you, Scott. It is always lovely to even vicariously and virtually be back in the Bay Area.
Well, and as a matter of fact, that's kind of where I wanted to start, because I was having flashbacks to the early days of the quarantine and pandemic. The last time we spoke by Zoom, which I like to, was your first time on Zoom, as I've been joking. But we were just in the early days. And in fact, this is where I kind of wanted to start, because the pandemic was new, and you were doing radio spots then about the sudden silence that had descended over the cacophonous city of Kolkata. So I kind of wanted to start with asking, how are you and your family? The pandemic recently in India has become completely and utterly catastrophic. So after an early time in which India seemed almost immune to the pandemic, at least based on what the government was telling us there, suddenly India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan have all suffered gravely. I think one of your pieces that I recently listened to was about empathy, Sandip. And so I know it's a difficult time, and I'm sorry to have to start there, but that's where we are, right? Like,
what's been interesting, this is early June, and in some bizarre way, it feels like Groundhog Day for us in Kolkata, because at this time last year, the first wave of the pandemic was going through India. The country was under lockdown. We had just recovered, been hit by a major super cyclone, which had flattened large areas of the state. This time, just a couple of weeks ago, another cyclone Yas, hit the state. Thankfully, it didn't affect Calcutta as much as people thought it would. It sort of bypassed. We got a lot of rain, but not everything wasn't flattened the way houses didn't fall and trees and all of that didn't quite happen the same way. But we're also again in a sort of lockdown. The difference is the numbers this time are catastrophically higher of COVID positive people testing positive, people testing, dying. Because when India went into a lockdown for the first time last year, it did so when there were only about 500 cases in the country. And now, every day it's like tens of thousands of cases. And for a while, the second wave in April and early May really seemed out of control. You probably saw the images of bodies piling up in crematoriums, people struggling to find enough oxygen in hospitals, people tweeting desperately, asking other people if they could locate oxygen cylinders for family members. And even now, now the situation is somewhat more under control. The numbers, we've been in sort of a lockdown, um, not a full lockdown, but in somewhat a partial lockdown, which has sort of flattened the infection rates a little bit. But one of the problems is vaccines are not quite available in the numbers that they are needed. So we're not really able to take advantage of this shutdown to vaccinate people aggressively. For example, in my case, I have had my first dose of the vaccine, but the appointment for the second dose got canceled. And because they don't have enough vaccines right now. And so now what the government has decided is that the gap between two doses of AstraZeneca, which was 6 to 8 weeks before, has suddenly been just sort of increased to 12 to 16 weeks. So now I'm not even eligible for a vaccine till the end of June. And then we'll see and there's lots of stories of people going to a vaccination center, waiting hours and hours to get a vaccine, which is not always the safest thing to do, because that means you're sort of sitting in a room with a bunch of people who may or may not be positive for hours and hours. So that's a huge problem right now, trying to ramp up the vaccine supplies and increase the vaccination rates. So it is a tense time. I mean, right before this call, I was trying to find out locations for safe homes in Kolkata for people I know who's, pretty much everyone at home has tested positive. There are elderly people, and these people don't require hospitalization, but in a place like Kolkata, it's not always easy to isolate at home because space is at a premium. If there's 6 people staying in a house, where will you isolate someone? So the government has set up these sort of safe homes where people who don't require hospitalization can be isolated if they're COVID positive. And was somebody, we're trying to find out, how do you access these homes? How do you, so these stories are happening. And just this afternoon, even as in some ways, there are some glimmers of hope that we're seeing sort of the light at the end of this particular tunnel. I've been following a writer friend. She's, I think, in her late 30s maybe, and she was tweeting that her family had tested positive. A few days ago, she tweeted that her mother-in-law had passed away. And then a couple of days ago, her husband was in the hospital. A couple of days ago, she was saying it was their marriage anniversary, asking people to pray for him. Today, I heard the husband had died. And then I heard her brother-in-law is on a ventilator. So, that is sort of the hard thing when you think of just like one family and so many people wiped out, like once sort of the adrenaline of what is happening wears out, how do people cope with loss in that degree, of generations lost? I mean, every day you'll hear some really tragic story. There was one about these 2 young men, twin brothers, who passed away within hours of each other without the other one knowing. But he sort of suspected because he kept saying, "How is my brother?" And they kept saying, "He's okay." He said, "I don't think he's okay." I mean, it's the empathy connection between twins, I guess. So, I mean, this will pass. This will pass, but for so many people, this is going to take a really long time for the people. It's always the people left behind will take a long time for them to deal with the cracks. And as someone said, I think Nina Masi, who is the Washington Post correspondent in India, she has a piece, I think today, about members of her family passing away, and including her grandfather. And she is in another city trying to organize care remotely. Her parents have tested positive. her mother is at her wit's end with the grandfather. And in some ways, the grandfather dies, and she says, I'll always feel like I could have done, more, but I'm dealing with my own positive status. I'm dealing with my mother's and these horrible, terrible choices that families have to make. And ultimately, I think she ends it with a very moving line where she says, in the end, the reckoning will be when you look around your dining table and see the empty chairs.
Yeah, well, it also occurs to me as a slight side note that one of my student co-hosts that interviewed you last year at this time very nearly died of COVID. Student, right? Very nearly died. Was on a ventilator for weeks, and is still. And this is the part that makes me angry. Is still paying off his stupid hospital bills, right? And stuff like that. So I mean, it's an
And
interesting
the
part that we
second
talked
wave
to
in
each
India,
other a year ago at this time, because he came.
The second wave has in fact hit young people much harder this time. In the first wave, it was mostly the elderly. The second wave, it has hit young people, and the young people are not, they're just about getting into the vaccination has been opened up for them. But it's been opened up, but there's not enough vaccines available for them. So it's kind of a tricky situation.
Well, and this leads me into my next question, which is I know a tricky one, but it's Pride Month, and so I was wondering how is it possible to describe how queer life in India is or is not been changed by the pandemic?
That's so interesting because you know, a couple of years ago, when gay sex was decriminalized in India, it was an occasion for great rejoicing. It felt like a huge victory for people. Many people, didn't really expect it to happen in their lifetimes. They thought we would at best go into a sort of a don't ask, don't tell kind of acceptance, which was always the case. I mean, as we all know, just because something is criminalized doesn't mean that people stop being gay. Gay people will, they find ways to lead their lives, no matter how repressive the conditions, as we see all over the world. Um, but it had, but the decriminalization had resulted in a kind of more openness. So companies were more forthcoming about their support for queer rights. I went to an event hosted by an international bank, which was hosting like a 2-day sort of diversity weekend at their offices, which was focused on LGBTQ issues. Then they invited me, this transgender activists, and all. And it was lovely because a group of like sort of the theater group in the bank, who are not necessarily queer, put together a little skit which dealt with a school teacher who is outed as a lesbian, and the kind of repercussions it has in the school and how they deal with it through sort of song, dance, and all. And it was rather lovely, and it felt a very hopeful time. But the fact is that for a lot of the events and things in Kolkata, there would be pride marches. Our pride usually happens at the end of the year in December because it's just cooler. In June, when the rest of the world has pride, it's either blazingly hot or pouring with rain, neither of which is conducive to marching on the street. So so we celebrate other people's pride right now and have our own in December when it's cooler. But so there were huge parades, and it was very festive. Even in 2019, I remember. And there was a Rainbow Literature Festival I went to in early 2019, which was sort of one of the first major queer literature festivals happening in Delhi, and they had people coming from different parts of the country. And now what has happened is that as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown, many of the places where queer people could gather have shut down. So, for example, every month there used to be these social events or parties at a hotel. You know, it was called the pink parties in Kolkata and kitty soup pink parties, and that was a place for people to gather, come together, yes, dance, and all of that, and even during the pandemic, when it had sort of seemed to be, India seemed to be over the hump, as it were, they had resumed some of those parties, you know, asking people to be masked. I hadn't been to it because I still didn't feel it was quite safe enough to go to one of those things. But they had resumed it, and I understand why, because for so many people, it was important. It was their only sort of social space outside the Zoom world and sort of a place where they could physically meet other people. So suddenly, all those spaces have shut down. The drop-in centers, the things, all the places where people could gather have shut down. And the result of a lockdown or a semi-lockdown means that people in general are locked down with their families, their blood families, which may not necessarily be the same or as accepting as their queer families. And for many people who in India and places like India live at home, queer people live at home. And so it is that party space, this friend space and stuff, which is their place where they can be freer and more and queer. And that is suddenly cut off. You know, people like me may be more privileged because you might have your own space or you're out to your family. But for people who may not be out to their family, or even if they're out to their family, are not necessarily, you know, it's families not may not be that comfortable with them being queer. They are stuck at home, and so that becomes a larger sort of psychological issue for people. The loneliness, the anxiety, and all of that you're feeling in general around the world, around the pandemic, gets magnified that much more when you are also in an environment where you may be at home, but you don't feel at home there. And so that, I think, has been a larger concern in terms of mental health, which has always been a huge issue in the LGBTQ community, dealing with mental health. And all of that, I think, has definitely been compounded by the pandemic. I've seen tweets by people who are trying to do mental health awareness with around queer issues. They do Zoom events where they might invite a mental health professional to come on and talk to people, which is all very wonderful. But you know, as we all know, in the end, there is that physical meeting of people, meeting with friends, has its own importance that cannot be replicated, even though a virtual world probably does allow you to connect to a lot other people you may not be connected to otherwise. So I think that is something that is still sort of unfolding as we speak. I mean, this Rainbow Literature Festival I was talking about didn't happen last year because of the pandemic. They're very much hopeful that they'll be able to have it this year in December, but who knows whether the second wave, you know, we're already hearing about forecasts for a third wave, so it'll all depend on that.
Yeah, well, since you mentioned the Rainbow Literature Festival, and since you were kind enough to send one of your many wonderful radio spots about it, maybe this would be a nice time to introduce that. What do you think?
Sure.
Let's do
Yeah.
that. So if you're joining us, if you just joined us, Sandip Roy is coming to us live from Kolkata. We were partly reminiscing that it was a year ago that he was last at Foothill College during at that time, our API Heritage Month. But early in the pandemic on both sides of the world. And so here we are now. Sandip does have, as I mentioned, a great radio career in the United States, but he also has a great radio career or podcast career, or whatever you would name it, there in India. And we should always remind ourselves that there are more English speakers in India than there are in the United States. So like, that's a pretty vast audience that you're dealing with out there. And congratulations for your amazing portable international career.
Thank you.
So I'm sort of setting up the idea that what we're gonna do is play a 6-minute clip that Sandip has provided. I'll put the link if you want to re-listen or share it out to your friends. I'll put the link in the chat while it's playing. And it describes exactly this. This Rainbow Literature Festival to which Sandip is referring. And as you can see on the share screen, this was recorded. This was like a year and a half. Well, 2 years ago, I guess. One of my month math is not
year and a half.
20 year and a half. 20. Yeah. So at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. So the pandemic had not yet struck. And so we'll sit back and take a listen. I'll scroll a little bit, but this is an audio clip, so off we go.
India has dozens of literature festivals these days. My city, Kolkata, has 3. But the Rainbow Lit Fest in Delhi this December was still special. It billed itself as queer and inclusive. In 2018, India decriminalized gay sex. This Lit Fest is part of a new India, breathing a little freer, a little gayer.
So this is a little bit adult content, but we undress and lie down on the bed. We kiss each other everywhere. I kiss his forehead.
That's part Indian, part Norwegian poet Vikram Kolmanskog. And this is Sandip Roy in Delhi. Years ago, a friend and I borrowed videotapes from Frameline, the organizer of the LGBT Film Festival in San Francisco, and took them in our suitcases to India. We had a mini LGBT film festival in the living room of an activist friend in Kolkata. In those days, gay sex was still criminalized. There were no pride parades. Actor Nandita Das starred in the 1996 film Fire about 2 middle-class Delhi housewives who fall in love. Das tells the Lit Fest no one would utter the L word in those days.
I mean, I remember English dailies would not even use the word gay, lesbian, or whatever. So, they were really humble and they would say things like, how does it feel when you read that kind of a scene?
I don't think any of us could have imagined that one day we'd all be at a Rainbow Lit Fest in Delhi with sponsors like the Royal Bank of Scotland, large Indian companies like Godrej, multinationals like Deloitte. Corporate India is waking up to the importance of diversity, says Parmesh Shahani, the head of Godrej India Culture Lab.
I've done enough research out there that says that being inclusive makes you more innovative. It makes you more desirable to work as an organization amongst millennials, which is what everyone is targeting.
It might make business sense, but is there enough for a full-fledged Lit Fest? Festival director Sharif D. Ranganekar actually apologized that there was too much to choose from with parallel sessions.
So if you like one session, would you want to be the other one as well?
A plethora of riches, writers, poets, activists. Famous classical musician Shubha Mudgal lent her support.
Why I offer my gratitude to the Rainbow Literature Festival for creating a space where diversity is welcomed and celebrated, not excluded and banished or segregated.
And diverse it is. Afghan-American novelist Nimat Sadat talking about all his multiple identities.
Being both gay and Afghan and American and ex-Muslim and refugee.
While Jerry Johnson tried to escape the identity box.
It's about moving away from the boundaries of LGBTQ. And if I had to put myself somewhere, I would put myself as a plus. I am the plus.
There were lawyers like Menaka Guruswamy who had argued the case in the Supreme Court of India.
No matter what society thinks or societal or majoritarian morality thinks, the only morality that is definitive, that is legal in this country is that of constitutional morality.
Mythologist Devdutt Patnaik pulled up pictures of sculptures of cross-dressing men and women in ancient temples to show this was always part of life in India.
So the woman is dressed cross-dressing and the man is cross-dressing. And it is in the Meenakshi Madurai temple corridors. Somebody has funded this exercise. So there is a patron, there is an artisan, there is a thought behind it. It's not random. It is not revolutionary. It's part of life.
There was even a puppeteer, reimagining a story from Oscar Wilde.
The priest tells me that my soul is worth all the gold in the world, in fact worth much more. And the merchant tells me that it is not worth a crypt piece of silver.
But the real wonder of the festival was not just what was happening on stage. The real miracle was the people. The activists telling the story of the first Pride Walk in India 20 years ago, the blonde drag queen, the older lesbian in a plaid shirt, the intersexed activist, the young Mr. Gay India in a flowing coat and a choker talking to a gray-haired feminist publisher about coming out to his mother.
No, but what kind of conversation? Because I came out to her almost 6 years ago, and it has been quite a journey for her as well to understand what queerness is about.
Human encounters in a world of apps. That is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Devdutt Patnaik.
You go over the rainbow and you reach a place where there is a pot of gold. This is the pot of gold. Wisdom.
This is Sandip Roy in Kolkata.
Okay, Sandip, thank you so much for sharing that link, which
it feels like another world.
Well, you know, that's the thing. I was thinking I probably should have played that first and then asked you how his life changed. Yeah, because that's like the before times, right? And it feels that way to me listening as well. But there's so much.
I mean, at the end, when I say something like, you know, human contact in a world of apps, I didn't think anything about that. That I was saying anything particularly surprising or meaningful. But now I'm like, wow, human contact in a world of apps.
Imagine that. No, and none of us knew. And it's really interesting that it was just as the first cases were coming in December 20. I mean, that was the the tiniest tip of the iceberg was beginning to appear on people's radar screens. And so, yeah, it really touches back. But I also love, for my students in particular that are joining us as part of the Queer Lit class at Foothill College, so much of what we talked about in the class, the rainbow of different voices coming out of South Asia these days, which is wonderful. Too much for a literature festival is a good thing. And I loved the little Oz touches too, since you make such wonderful use of Alice in Wonderland and Oz in your novel that we just completed reading with Bangladesh, the South Asian drag queen that the older South Asian woman straight encounters in this wild way. So it really brought me back that way. So I think it's for those of us who are not familiar with queer life in India, I think it's fascinating. I want to ask, it's interesting to me because it comes up all the time at Foothill College and in the class and even in our, even in faculty meetings, in our queer support groups, the use of the word queer, right? And I was actually hearing a lot of the Q word, which, as you know, for older generations is sometimes uncomfortable, right? I've certainly embraced it, and I've been a queer theorist, a teeny minor one, for all these decades. But it still causes a lot of discussion, interestingly enough. I can remember 3 discussions in the last month in planning for Pride Month or in revising the curriculum about should we be using the word queer? Is everyone comfortable with it? So it sounds like it's gotten quite comfortable in for most South Asians that were participating in your interview, at least.
Yeah, I think what basically has happened is that people have, in fact, been starting to use it as a portmanteau word for LGBTQ+. They just think queer is a quicker and easier way of saying it. And the other thing is that because the sort of formal LGBTQ movement in India, in the way that the movement is defined in a place like America, happened somewhat later, queer doesn't have as much history, trauma, associated with it. In a way, India has came upon the movement in India came upon the word queer after it had already, the processing had already happened in the US. So, people didn't have to reclaim that word in the way many people had to do in the US. It was not really a term of abuse for, I mean, there are a lot of words in Indian languages, many Indian languages, which are abusive terms for, or being people who are perceived as queer or effeminate or various, I think those words are still problematic, and people sometimes will try and reclaim those words. Those are harder words, but queer in a way already came sort of processed and dealt with by theorists in
Cleaned
the
up,
West.
embraced.
It was cleaned up, and it was already dry cleaned by the time it reached us. And so people were able to wear it a little more easily. And it's only later, I think, that people got more apprised of the politics behind it. And even now, I've just seen it mostly people using it as a way of trying not to miss any letter in their LGBTQ. They're so afraid they'll miss a letter that they say, well, we'll just say queer instead, and hopefully that should cover everybody.
Well, yes, and again, that's come up a lot, and it is interesting to me. I love the author who said, "I am the plus." Right?
Yeah.
I thought that was a phrase I wanted to hang on to, because I think saying "I'm the plus" is a really beautiful thing. I'm probably going to switch Zoom backgrounds on you here, because I really love the design that Foothill College did this year, partly because this has been part of my journey as somebody, who started out as the gay student alliance advisor, or whatever we were calling it. Right. I mean, I've been doing this for 31 years, literally, at Foothill College. So I love the design that our students came up with this year, precisely because it's been a journey for me to experience all these different identities and learn more about them. Also to acknowledge that, I hope this was not me personally, but that white gay men in the United States were often extremely racist, exclusionary, misogynist, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's kind of fun to hear someone say, "I'm the plus."
I'm the plus.
I am the plus. Absolutely.
And I think I like that because Jerry's a good friend, and I like that because it sort of is an indication that that this is something that's still evolving and forming. There is still plus. It's not that we've reached the last letter and all the identities have been chalked out and there's no room for anyone more at the table. There's always room for a plus. You can always bring a +1 to this particular table. And so I do like that. And in fact, it just reminded me that I don't think the book is out yet, but I was like a major mainstream publisher in India just sent me this book. It said, like, they give these books to people to pre-read, just in case you catch any red flags, sort of a sensitivity read. And it was a sensitivity read, a book which was basically a gay dating guide for Indians. And I was just,
wow.
I was like, I didn't think I'd live to see the day when when a major publisher would think that, okay, that this is a book that they need to bring out. And I said, okay, thinking, it'll be like a quick, breezy read. And it was like some 300 pages long, like a massive tome. And he had like, this guy had, apart from the guide, he had some 75 case histories of his own dating experiences with persons A, B, C. And I was just plowing through this book, and I was thinking, like, wow, when you say when the Sharif in the piece says that, oh my God, we have too many things to include in one lit fest, I was like, wow, we've come to a point where I'm getting exhausted reading the gay dating guide to India, which at one time would have been, when I used to edit the first South Asian LGBT magazine right out of the Bay Area, where it was called Tricone. When I used to edit that, that was 8 pages long, that first magazine. And and it came out every once a quarter, and every quarter we'd be like nervous about whether we'd have enough content for the next magazine. And if we came across, a book that, for example, the writer Vikram Seth had written, A Suitable Boy, which is what, I don't know, some 1,300 pages long. And on page 700, there is a sort of kind of gay, sort of gay character. And we were like, oh, we'll have to do an entire article on this page, because we have to fill our magazine. There's like, is there going to be enough South Asian LGBT thing to fill up a magazine every quarter? And now we have a gay guide coming out. So yeah, things have definitely changed.
Well, and then again, for the students that are tuning in that have just read your novel, don't let him know. I mean, two of the most important scenes are, the older character who finally goes on a date and then tragically is robbed and beaten up and threatened with blackmail, which was not an unusual event, right? And your novel is set many decades ago, I need to clarify, but that's the point, is like this kind of moving forward, or the two central characters who are not able to continue their relationship because there is no there. So, childhood, high school lovers who love each other deeply, but there's no way to continue. So it's an interesting marker even for your own novel that the concept of gay dating in the novel basically didn't exist. And that's partly what the novel is about. How do you live under those conditions? How do you survive?
Yeah, you do survive, and that's a very good point. What is interesting, Scott, is that in some ways, yeah, it's a very different India where, now a major publisher is bringing out a gay dating guide, and all of that. And yet, I wouldn't say that the India of my book is gone either. That India is, just as there are all these young Indians who will read that gay dating guide and laugh because they can relate to the stories of misfired dates from their own experiences with dating apps. There will be equally and probably more gay or questioning LGBTQ Indians who will feel that they still don't have a place where they can be comfortably themselves, that they will still feel scared to go out on that date with somebody. And there are still tragically too many people who still commit suicide in this country because they feel like they cannot come out because they feel like their families will not, that it would hurt their families too much if they came out. There are still stories of lesbian suicides, of people who make a pact and because somebody has to get married because they cannot escape the marriage pressure and stuff. So all of that, even soon after my book came out, there was a case in Delhi about where a young woman who's a doctor commits suicide because she discovers her husband, who is also a doctor, is gay and continues to have a relationship with another man on the side. She catches him, he says sorry, won't happen again, then it happens again, and then she kills herself. And I still remember people kept saying, why in this day and age did she kill herself? Because divorce is not necessary, she could walk away. And it always made me think why nobody was asking why in this day and age did he have to get married. We all were asking, why did she have to kill herself? But really the question is, why did he, who's a doctor, who has access to or many kinds of resources out there, still feel like he needed to get married to make his family happy? And I know people still right now in Calcutta, people whom I have partied with at these gay parties that I've talked to you about, who have gotten married because they feel that as they grow older, as a gay person, they don't really see a future for themselves. They think like, oh, party is fine as long as you're in your 20s and 30s. but after that, what is going to happen, and who will look after me, who will be there for me, and they've gotten married, and I actually, I mean, supposedly in this case, the wife is aware of a lot of these issues, but it boils down to the larger issue as to that the issues and the problems and fears that are part of Don't Let Him Know have not disappeared with decriminalization. And I think that's a very important point for all of us to remember. And people in the United States do know it. I mean, the law, the changing of a law, whether it is against gay sex, or it is a law around racial discrimination, or a law around sexual discrimination, changing of a law is just the first step. Changing of attitudes, changing of society takes much longer, and so I mean, India will also be having to deal with that. And I mean, it's still there are more and more young people coming out and being themselves, which is a great and wonderful thing to see. But we're still in a phase where I remember going to the first sort of, it was a gay men's conference in Bombay in the 1990s. And it was a 3 or 4 day event. And at the end of it, we were taking this big group picture. And then somebody said, okay, now we'll take a picture that we'll give to the media. So those of you who don't want to be in the picture, leave. You need to step aside because that's going to be for public consumption. And a lot of people had to step aside because of their families, jobs, and all of that. And I think those pressures still hang heavy on people's heads today. I mean, so yeah, we shouldn't assume that because laws have changed, because the Gay Guide to Dating is coming out, that it's entirely a different country. India exists in many centuries at the same time.
Yeah, and I also want to pause, speaking of students and colleagues who are in the room with us, if anybody wants to ask Sandip a question, I am always full of questions. I have many more, but we are really thrilled if you, so you could either put your question in the chat or use your reactions button to raise your hand, and we can unmute you. What we prefer is that you actually ask the question in person, and we'll unmute you and you can put your screen up. But meanwhile, I do want to continue this conversation because you've got me going. Sandip, what I was going to say was, as you know, that we've had this backlash with so many legislatures passing anti-trans laws. I just saw a survey that said something like 30% of trans teens contemplated suicide in the last 12 months. I have students enrolled in my class now who can't tell their family that they're enrolled in the class, right? So I think that, and you know this really well, I'm preaching to the choir, but like the situation in the United States is not that different either. I mean, just because we've made many steps forward, we've also taken some steps backwards radically. In the opening ceremony yesterday, I was, I hope politely, berating the president of the college because I don't think that Foothill has made enough steps to be trans inclusive at all, or even queer inclusive. And that's a painful thing for me to say about my own college. Obviously we're trying, but there's some basic things that need to change. So has there been a backlash after your Indian Supreme Court victory, which decriminalized gay sex of any kind, same-sex expression? Has there been a backlash in the Modi years on a legal front, the way we've been experiencing it here in the United States?
So one of the things, the point is with, I always often see that, when I was growing up, the issue was not as much homophobia as homo ignorance, because the issue of gay life was never part of everyday discourse. People didn't really talk about it. So in that sense, people were not phobic as much as they were indifferent or unaware of the issue. So in some bizarre ways, especially gay men could get away with a lot of things because people just didn't question two men living together, for example, that would not raise eyebrows. It would probably raise a lot more eyebrows if an unmarried man and a woman were living together. And in fact, even for a few years ago, if a man and a woman walked into a hotel in some parts of India, they might be asked to show a marriage certificate before a room would be given to them. Two men walking up and asking for a room would not raise any eyebrows at all. But with progress and visibility, obviously the other side of the coin is the backlash that is inevitable. Should progress be held back because of the fear of backlash? Of course not. But it is, we have to take into account that there will be a backlash, and there hasn't been a backlash in that sense because one of the things worth remembering is that the change in the law did not come through the parliament. The government basically washed its hands of it. One of a politician named Shashi Tharoor did try to introduce a private member of parliament's bill to decriminalize this thing, but it never even came up for a hearing. Even his own party did not want to have anything to do with it. It was people just didn't want to touch the issue. So they basically shunted the ball over to the court and let the court deal with it. And the court at one point had bounced it back to parliament, but then in that 2018 case, they took it, they decriminalized it with a 5-judge bench did it. But what the government has accepted that decriminalization, but they basically said that's the line. We're not going to give anybody any rights as a result of it. So the issue now has become always, we decriminalize gay sex, but don't be thinking about getting rights in terms of marriage and things. These have come up in court, and the government has made it clear, no way, we are not going there. Gay people, so there are, I think that, people focus on same-sex marriage issues, but I think there are other issues that will be more important. For example, because there's still no recognition of a partnership that is not a heterosexual partnership in that sense. So in terms of inheritance, in terms of being able to put your partner on your life insurance program, all of these things are going to be issues that India will have to grapple with. And one of the things that has been happening more and more and after this thing is that while there has not been any real political movement to confer more rights to queer Indians, there have been many corporations have been starting to put in non-discrimination clauses. Corporations have been offering people who are transgender and want to go through sexual reassignment surgery so that they can do it through the corporation's insurance programs. Corporations have been doing that. So in some sense, especially the larger corporates is where a lot of activists have focused their attention. And there's even been, for example, there was a sort of a job fair which was hosted by different corporations targeting the LGBTQ community, sort of trying to advertise my company as a gay-friendly place. And one of my friends who was involved with it, Parmesh Shahani, whom we heard in that clip, said, well, it's just wonderful to see that, to see a mother coming with her gay son to a company to just check out and make sure that the company is gay friendly enough for her son to work in, which is like a huge sign of hope. So, Indian mothers
I love that.
do this. So she's like, are you, my son is gay. I want gay. I want him to be in a good place. I want to make sure, are you a gay friendly company? So that is where more than in the political scene. But the other thing that has happened in India is that because India has a long history of transgender activism, because of the hijra community, and the sort of the idea of third gender is so much part of Indian, both Hindu mythology, going back to our myths. In fact, our myths have a lot of transgender stories in them. So that community, so there has been, even before the Supreme Court decriminalized gay sex, or what they call sex against the order of nature, there was actually a court ruling that conferred rights and privileges on people, the transgender community, in terms of asking the government to do more programs to integrate them, offer them benefits, offer them job training and things like that. So there is a large and active transgender movement aside from the the larger LGBT movement as well.
Well, now, and Angelica had early asked a question that overlaps with this because, and I think it still makes a great follow-up question. It's kind of about the time lag, or the perceived time lag that Americans would have about why did it take so long? And you partly addressed that, but Angelica, we've unmuted you, so I'd love to have you ask your question, because I actually think it's a very important follow-up, particularly for an American audience.
So my question was, what specifically caused the US to legalize it before India? Because in the US it was in 2003, but in India it was only just recently.
I want to put a shout out for the British. I would give the one-word answer, the British. But
the British.
You may disagree.
So the anti-sodomy law is a remnant of the penal code that the British left behind. This is Lord Macaulay's code. So it's a Victorian era law that was remained in the Indian penal code. Now, we like to blame the British for the law, but are you snickering at penal code? Are you giggling at the penal code?
My co-host Rick is a British citizen. She's a British American citizen, so he was in the chat.
Yeah,
he was taking umbrage. Although I must say, Rick, that I think that globally the impact of those sodomy laws, which were imposed on colonial cultures, including India's, which were much more queer friendly prior to colonialization.
Yeah.
So I do think. I mean,
people often say
I still have to put it on the British a bit.
The British put us into the corset, they because it was a Victorian time, and they put it. But while we love to blame the British for many things, I would also say that, India has been independent since 1947. India could have chosen to junk that along with many other British things that they junked as a result of independence. But people chose to keep it on the books. And to Angelica's question, it has been a long struggle because basically, unlike the US, the sort of gay movement in the US, which started in the 60s and 70s, all of that, India didn't have it happening at that time. This law did not, in fact, in some ways, one would say that the timeline for India was shorter than the US because it was much later. It was the first time this law was actually challenged was after the AIDS epidemic happened, and a non-governmental organization tried to distribute condoms in a jail in New Delhi. And they were told by the jail superintendent that I cannot let you distribute condoms because that would mean I'm effectively condoning homosexual acts. And so you need to go and change the law that criminalizes homosexual acts before I can let you distribute condoms in my prison. So it was challenged on those grounds. And it took, it was thrown out because they said, we need people who are actually affected by it to make the challenge in case in court. And at that time, there was almost nobody who was willing to stand up in an open court and say, I want this law change because it affects me personally. It affects my right to life, liberty, and happiness. So it took a long time. And then finally, when this court case was in 2018, we had various different people, including parents of LGBT people, who filed a petition saying it needs to change because it affects our lives. And in fact, before that, when it had not been overturned, the judge had said it is something that only affects a minuscule minority. And so it required more people to stand up in an open courtroom and say, I am queer and I am affected by this law and you need to do justice by me. And I think one of the most profound things that a judge said when overturning the law, and they in fact used a lot of the precedent of the US case, Lawrence versus Texas, and all of that came up in this case history. And one of the things that one of the judges said was, I think we owe a profound apology to LGBT people in this country. And for the Supreme Court judge to say that in an open court was, I think, very moving to a lot of people like me who felt, kind of cynical about the whole thing. But it was moving because you don't have, everybody feels the pain of not being acknowledged, even if we dress it up in camps and furs and feathers and pretend we don't care. But at some level, the pain of being different, of not fitting in is there deep inside. And it is meaningful, even if it has no legal standing, it is meaningful when a judge of the Supreme Court says, I'm sorry.
Well, it happened here with Justice Kennedy's incredibly eloquent statement for us in the United States.
Sometimes, sometimes it's not about rights, it's about acknowledgement of pain.
And respect, yes. I completely agree. Okay, now we have a number of other students. I know that we're already an hour in, Sandip, and I do want to.
I'm okay. I'm okay.
Going? Okay, great.
I don't have any parties to go to in a lockdown.
And you do have a bit of a fan club in my class too. I have to warn you. So we'll see. So Jack is next up in the queue, and Jack, I think you're unmuted. If you want to ask your question, please go ahead.
Yeah. So my question was, had the UK not colonized India, how do you think today's Indian LGBT community would look different?
That's an interesting question, Jack. It's very hard for us to think of India not having been colonized by the UK. For one thing, if we had not been colonized, I may not have been here speaking to you at all. I may not have written a book called Don't Let Him Know in English. And, so us being colonized gave India things that India thinks of them as Indian right now, playing cricket and stuff, all of that has become so much part of India right now. It's hard to think of it not being colonized. But I think what would have happened if it was not, is that in terms of the LGBTQ movement would have probably been a much more gender fluid sort of acceptance of gender fluidity, which is true in many cultures of the world before colonization happened. And I think there is actually a really interesting book that you might want to read. It's by a South African journalist named Mark Gevisser, and it's called The Pink Line. And it looks at the LGBTQ movement in different parts of the world, including India, Indonesia, South Africa. And one of the things he says, it's not just about colonization. It's a sort of that now we have a global language of LGBT rights that has come up. And this is, you even go back to Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, talking about it at the United Nations, which was a wonderful thing, but it also meant that it created certain boxes in which a global LGBTQ movement needed to fit in to access, to speak that language of rights, and which meant that there was probably less room for more ambiguous gender fluid definitions, identities that people had carved for themselves, because there was a lot more emphasis on coming out as one L or G or B or T or whatever you chose to be, whereas it may have been more of a spectrum of, more of a fluid spectrum of identities before, and that doesn't fit into certain identity boxes that a global movement wants to, because as soon as you have a global movement, it tries to normalize is a horrible word to use in this context, but it tries to create boxes that are the same all around the world that all of us can fit in. And the fact is, different cultures evolve differently, and those boxes don't work. That boxes that work for India might not work for Indonesia, might not work for the Philippines. And so I think, yeah, if the British had not come, I think we would have had a more gender fluid culture. But but what shape it would have taken is hard to tell, because I think there would still be a certain pressure to conform to a more global LGBT definition of culture that that a Gates Foundation or somebody else would recognize.
Great answer. Vivian is up next. Vivian, I think you're unmuted. If you would like to ask your question, please do.
So Vivian is having some technical difficulties. So I'm going to read her question for her. She can't use her mic today.
Okay.
Her question is, she was wondering, currently, does all of the LGBT community share the same rights in India?
Well, that's a sort of easy question. But if you leave, so I'm going to leave transgender out of this for now and say we share the same rights, as in we don't have any. It's easy to say we share the same rights because we don't really have any rights. All we have is a decriminalization, which is not a granting of any rights. So all it means, all that it did, which was that it means that for that two consenting adults having sex cannot be thrown into prison for doing that. So that sword was lifted from over people's heads, even though people say like this was not something that was enforced very often, but it was a tool in the hands of people who wanted to harass LGBT people. So it conferred no more rights than that. So as I said before, it didn't mean that today if my partner would have the same rights as a spouse or a sort of civil marriage kind of issues. It doesn't have, there are no rights in terms of adoption. Gay people cannot adopt children. They cannot go through a surrogate if they want to have a child in India. They cannot adopt a child in India the way a heterosexual couple might be able to do. So in that sense, they don't have the rights. And I think those are the new frontiers one by one, where it will have to be challenged, where they will say like, okay, if a heterosexual couple can adopt a child, why can't we? And then that case will have to be fought out in courts. But those are all going to be steps going forward. But the removal of the law was a very necessary and first step to happen in order for any of these future fights to happen. And I think there will be more of these fights that will be happening in a court.
Well, and as it was in the United States in 2003,
right.
It was a huge step. Brittany is next. Brittany, you want to go ahead and ask your question? Please do.
Hello. I was wondering if and how acceptance around members of the queer community differ amongst castes. Like, is it easier for members of certain castes to come out than others?
Brittany, I think the answer to that is it's a kind of complicated issue between both caste and class. So if often people who are upper caste may be upper class, or so it depends on, it's not so much that your caste affects how you come out, but sort of the circumstances that you've been raised in. So if you come from, if you've been raised in a metropolitan city, you've had access to, you've perhaps gone to a good school where you've an English medium school or something, and you have access, you have certain kinds of privilege. It allows you to access to sort of mobility that allows you to come out a little easier than others. I think the larger issue with a lot of people faced with coming out is that they often feel like they need to have a certain amount of financial independence, that they don't feel like if I come out and if it all goes horribly wrong within my family, if there's no acceptance, then what? And the higher you go up the caste ladder and the higher you go up the class ladder, the more the chances that you might be able to have certain amount of financial independence that will allow you then to be more confident about coming out. But there have been other interesting stories that have happened. I mean, there are several Dalit, which is sort of the lowest caste or the backward caste in India, queer activists in those categories. There's a lot of literature coming out in those areas that talk about the intersections of caste and sexuality and how that can be, in fact, a double burden for people to bear because they may face discrimination on two different levels at the same time from people, gay people like any other can be horribly discriminatory. People tend to associate with people who are more like themselves. And if you are somebody from a lower caste, you may be oppressed, multiple ways, oppressed in multiple ways, which makes it that much harder for you to come out. So it is, I mean, your question is very much true, but there's no easy answer to say that, oh, if you're one caste, you'll definitely have an easier time coming out than others.
Okay, Rick is up next. Rick, your question. Oh, Rick, you're muted.
One of these days. I know that the caste system was there before the British arrived, and the caste system is still there after the British left. Do you ever see the caste system fading away in the future?
Not in my lifetime. It may be it may become less potent in some parts of India than others, but it will remain because it is such a social construct that is so embedded in people's consciousness that people, even if they don't think of themselves as being casteist, in their unconscious minds, even I can be very casteist in some, because I mean, the reason I'm going to say it's not going to go away fast is that even while pretend people say like, oh, we don't care about caste anymore, if you look at sort of the Sunday newspapers marital columns, you will see over and over again people from a certain caste looking for a partner from people of that same caste. And they will say that it's really, no, it's just about background. I want to find someone who's sort of like me socially and stuff. But the fact that you make caste part of that equation means that at some level, it's there. It will remain. And I think in many parts of India, people, when you talk to people, they will ask you your last name because that's a way of trying to peg you to figure out what your caste is. And in fact, right now, I don't know the status. There is a case going on in California around involved in the Bay Area involving the company Cisco, the software giant, where an Indian who is from the lower caste alleges that he faced caste discrimination in Cisco from other Indians who were of a higher caste who discriminated against him in sort of their job prospects and stuff. So basically you bring your caste baggage to the US, but you dress it as sort of an old boys club, and he felt, and the interesting thing, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in one of the biggest problems in the US is because caste is not counted as one of the modes of discrimination in the way race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation is. So it's very difficult to prove a case of caste discrimination because you have to first introduce the concept of caste as an acceptable, and in fact, the cases around that have gotten thrown out by US courts, but California is pursuing one involving Cisco right now.
And could we just not start a pink caste for us?
You could, but I hate to tell you, Rick, I think there's probably a lot of queer people who are equally caste conscious around them. So they may be pink caste, but it doesn't mean they will give up their own other caste hang-ups.
Also, they need to have two castes.
Yeah, so they'll be like, I'm an upper pink caste versus you're a lower pink caste.
Well, and I have to say in all due humility and remind us all that like this question comes up, it's it's a little bit like asking, will I live to see a post-racist United States? And I'm afraid that the last year has convinced me that I will not live that long, which is really a tragic thing, but that's just the reality that we've all been re-educated in every single way. So it's an aspiration, but.
And I think one of the things I would just point out in terms of Brittany's question is that, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that that sort of the first generation of LGBT activists in India were all upper caste. Because being upper caste, it wasn't big. It was more to do with the fact that just being upper caste meant you had more privileges. When you had more privileges meant that you went to these engineering colleges and stuff. You went abroad to a place like the Bay Area, and then you founded a group like Tricone there. So it wasn't that they were consciously exerting caste privilege, but their upper caste granted them that sort of mobility to go abroad and found a group like Tricone, that kind of access. In the same way, but you would say that the LGBT movement in the US originally were a lot of white men who started out, and then others joined in, and now it's heartening to see that there is much more Dalit or the lowest caste activism within the queer scene, but that was not true 20 years ago.
Is there a male-female divide? I mean, years ago in the Castro, and to some degree, there's still a hangover, as you remember. I was appalled when I came out to be told, you're not supposed to associate with lesbians. I mean, it was really a kind of ridiculous. It was ridiculous and embarrassing. But also that, is there a difference in the way that, say, lesbian couples are treated versus same-sex male couples of all different varieties, as my background?
I think there is a male-female divide, definitely, I would say. So if you go to these parties that I was talking about in a city like Kolkata, it would be largely men, or you'd see very few lesbians at some of these parties. Lesbians would have their own groups. And the one place where people would come together is every year there would be a film festival called Dialogues, which was an LGBTQ festival. And that was sponsored by both gay groups and the local lesbian group. And so there would be a little more mingling, but otherwise there would not be. And I think for many lesbian couples, I mean, there have been so many stories of lesbian suicides, because I think that is a reality of, again, the double pressure you face as a lesbian and a woman, and the pressure of marriage so strong on women that many of them feel like they are unable to resist it, and then ends up having very tragic consequences. So definitely there is a certain divide, and I don't know if it's quite the same as, say, in the US, but when you see these, I mean, people do try and bridge it, and organizations like at that Rainbow Literature Festival had tried to be very conscious in bringing together different voices, but yeah, there's still a lot that would need to be done to say that there's no divide. I think that divide will stay for a while.
Well, and again, in all humility, my lesbian in the United States would say the same thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's same. It's because it's privilege.
Yes.
It's about privilege. It's about access. It's about simple things like money. Who ends up making more money? Again, the same thing of who ends up having more mobility, more the ability to lead their own lives. There's the gender divide is always there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for being so generous with your time, Rick. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we've gotten through our queue of questions for now. And
yep, I was the last question.
Okay, good. Well, that's good. I didn't want to leave anybody out accidentally, since I'm not as focused on the chat as maybe I should be sometimes. Focus on Sandip. Sandip, thank you again so much. This was a really interesting conversation for me this year, Sandip. I will look forward to another in the near future, but it's been a pleasure, and I've learned, as I always do, I've learned so much. I go back all the way to our mutual friend Chitra Divakaruni, also a well-known author who was a professor at Foothill College. So I remember her handing me copies of Tricone and saying, here, you might be interested in this. And she's always been a great ally. She's to herself, but like I feel like I've been learning from you for all these many decades, and this was really a pleasure to learn more. I'm sorry that the conversation has occurred in such dark times. It was a hard place to start the conversation to ask you about the pandemic, but necessary to acknowledge where we are right now. Let's hope that next year we are in a happier place, and that we don't have to begin on such a grim note as we did this year.
That's definitely. I mean, I think this one thing that we've learned as queer people growing up in places where it wasn't that easy to be queer is that you have to have hope. I mean, if any group of people have learned the importance of holding on to hope, it's queer people. I mean, that is how so many of us got through the times when we often felt like we were the only gay in the village, so to speak. But there was always the hope that you'd find somebody else. So we know a thing or two about hope.
Well, and your novel is about that also, right? Like I reference two of the grimmer scenes in the novel, but I mean, it's one of the reasons it's so popular is that you have your wonderful light and humorous comic touch, honestly, and you bring a really, that wisdom that being able to laugh at situations can bring. So thank you for always bringing that too.
Thank you.
We will look forward to speaking with you again, I think next year, if I can send my
make a date
earlier than usual, which is last minute. Sandip is very generous in dealing with my always last minute desperate invitations. So I'll look forward to another conversation.
Thank you. And by that time, hopefully it'll be a somewhat different world, and I'll be able to go and have a haircut. Man, I miss being able to get a haircut.
That needs a whole short story by itself. Okay, well, I'm going to sign off from both Foothill College and the Stanford Gen channel. Sandip, go get some sleep late at night after midnight in Kolkata, as far as I can, if I remember correctly. And we will be posting the Zoom link for the recording of this conversation soon on the Stanford Gen channel and on the Foothill College webpage for Pride Month. So if you want to recommend it to other people or if you want to review it, then that's great. And that will be made available to you as soon as I hurry up and finish editing all of this. Okay, bye-bye, Sandip.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much.